In my last video, I took a look at Frank Zappa's enormous musical and, above all, personal transformation in 1972, following all the disastrous events that took place in 1971. What might have led another person to resignation seemed to trigger in him an openness that led him to explore, well, the workings of the universe. Of course, in the unique way that can only be attributed to Frank Zappa. Somewhat hidden, yet still perceptible. Words should be examined closely in Frank Zappa's work, for it may be that he uses them merely because his listeners like the sound of a voice, because the listeners want to sing along, as he himself once said.
I have to write lyrics because people like to hear the human voice attached to instruments.
And sometimes not.
If you try and sing a complicated text, a complicated text is not a collection of words that are readily apparent. If you start talking about the leaves, the love, baby, those things, words you've already heard a million times. Text doesn't matter because you can take those words and sing them melismatically, turn them all over the place, and people can still follow the contour of the idea. But if you're talking about concepts or using phrases which are unfamiliar, it's hard to get that information across if you're singing elaborate musical lines at the same time. I do that every once in a while just to be nasty, but most of the time, if the idea is out there someplace, I try and talk it.
The essence of his respective compositions is clearly to be found in the sound, in the instrumental. Here, you just have to remember his ideas about musical notes as heads of pins, that every head of each pin has a detailed illustration on it. So the head of each pin is working like each letter in a sentence. The sum of these letters forms the words. The sum of the words forms the text. The text conveys the information. That's language. The detailed illustrations on the pins that Frank Zappa is talking about are comparable to hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs of a very high standard. Beyond it, for sure. Just one example. In ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, the depiction of an owl represents the letter M. So if you see an owl at the beginning of an ancient Egyptian word, that word begins with an M, like, for example, sorry, I'm getting lost in examples again. Be that as it may, Frank Zappa's instrumental pieces are language, and should he ever briefly quote another composer's work, you should place this quotation in the context of Frank Zappa's imaginary narrative, if it occurs. It could be a critique or a compliment. Then you might possibly find yourself in a Gada Stravinsky. As a great example without quotes, I'd like to briefly mention Zappa's song Yo Mama here. The lyrics tell us that someone who hangs around with their mom for too long might get a few chores done, but loses their independence, smokes in their pajamas, and ends up setting themselves on fire, or sinks into insignificance and will never survive on the streets. A stupid and ugly situation. After this text, the song could end with laughter or tears for the pitiful creature, with a la 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 or boo-hoo. But not with Zappa. With Zappa, fanfares sound, the piece swells to an incredible magnitude, and one of the greatest guitar solos that human fingers have ever played on a guitar neck is heard. This solo breaks completely away from the song's lyrics and contains the true message of the composition. It's about what happens when you break free from life's predetermined rut and set out onto the street, on the path to yourself. A manifesto, the instrumental equivalent of the answer to the question, what is freaking out? instrumental is often thrown around casually when a piece of music has no vocals. But it is important to note that this term contains the words to instruct, from the Latin instruire equals to prepare, to equip, which means to inform someone, and mental, which stands for related to the mind. I mean, if you want to say it in the language of birds, or cant or slang, if you want. In the magnificent interview that Ben Watson, the author, poet, and also satirist, conducted with Frank Zappa in 1993, Watson said, "People find the mixture of signals in your music, cerebral abstractions 1 minute, shocking moments of human dishevelment the next. People find this very confusing." And Zappa asked, "Why?" Watson continued to ask, "Do you have any advice?" And Zappa finally explained, "Well, that's the universe. It's the way the universe is." As I did in another video, I'd like to let the comic book writer Alan Moore, whom I greatly admire, speak here, as I think it's very fitting.
When we are doing the will of our true self, we are inevitably doing the will of the universe. In magic, these are seen as indistinguishable. That every human soul is in fact one human soul. It is the soul of the universe itself, and as long as you are doing the will of the universe, then it is impossible to do anything wrong.
With your mama, she could do your laundry and cook for you. Maybe you should stay with your mama. You're really kind of stupid and ugly too. And you should never smoke in pajamas. You might start a fire and burn your face. Maybe you'll return to Managua. You could go unnoticed in such a place. You ain't really made for being out in the street. Ain't much hope for a fool like you. 'Cause if you play the game, you will get beat.
The universe is scientifically measured through calculations of space and time, light and speed, quantum physics. Actually, my last video was supposed to lead up to this topic. The wonderful song, "It Just Might Be a One-Shot Deal," was only briefly mentioned in my handwritten intro. But then along came the frog with his statue full of sand and my over 20-year-old comic, which hardly anyone knows, hopping over, and I lost myself, thanks to the big note, completely in a dream. I want to thank you for the flattering comments on my video. They mean a lot to me. I'd especially like to highlight one viewer's comment. This viewer wrote that Frank Zappa, confined to a wheelchair and moved by deep thoughts, likely also pondered the meaning of time itself, and mentioned in his comment the title and composition of a Zappa masterpiece that also dates from 1972 and is filled with time. Here I'll show you again a photo of my notepad from the last video. Well then, dear Mr. John Tobacco and dear esteemed audience, welcome to the views of an average dog on the incredible masterpiece known as
The Adventures of Gregory Peccary.
The most obvious thing about Frank Zappa's title for this composition is, of course, the phonetic similarity to the name of the actor, Gregory Peck. You don't have to comb through Gregory Peck's filmography to find a clue as to the actor's significance in Zappa's Adventures of Gregory Peccary. There is, admittedly, a movie called Marooned, in which three guys are stranded in the emptiness of space, but no red-brown sofa appears in it, so let's just enjoy the pun of the homophone. Closer to the subject, of course, is Pope Gregory XIII. He invented the Gregorian calendar, named after him, which was introduced in October 1582 as the standard for a new division of time. And then there's the peccary, a small wild boar whose short fur around the neck features a white marking, also known as a white collar. On a map drawn by a certain R.A. Donkin, you can clearly see the habitats of this small wild boar. It gets around quite a bit, as you can see. The reputation of the small wild boar varies enormously from region to region. While in some cultural regions it is considered dirty and unsuitable for a barbecue, in other cultural regions, the small wild boar is regarded as semi-human and appears as the companion of a fertility goddess. These drastic and varied perspectives on a single creature are clearly defined by humans, some of whom belong to a specific subgroup of pigs. Some of these pigs have wings. Some of these pigs even have their own kind of music that can influence smoke. But I stray from the point. For Frank Zappa's story about the adventures of a peccary named Gregory, the white collar is significant. The term white collar was coined in 1930s America. A white-collar worker is a person who performs knowledge-based, aptitude-based, managerial, or administrative work generally performed in an office or similar setting. White-collar workers include career paths related to banking, finance, compliance, legal, risk management, internal audit, data privacy, cybersecurity, insurance, government, consulting, scientific research, library and information science, archival science, accountancy, business and executive management, customer support, design, economics, science, technology, engineering, market research, human resources, operations research, marketing, public relations, real estate, information technology, networking, healthcare, architecture, and research and development. In contrast, blue-collar workers perform manual labor or work in skilled trades. Pink-collar workers work in care, healthcare, social work, or teaching. Green-collar workers specifically work in the environmental sector, and gray-collar jobs combine manual labor and skilled trades with non-manual or managerial duties. In the age of the internet, this concept has been lost. Today, people simply distinguish between background, connections, and the amount of cocaine one can snort in higher positions.
Chop a line now.
But the year is 1972, the year in which Frank Zappa rises like a phoenix from the ashes of a rainbow theater to whisk us away to new, distant galaxies of entertainment, humor, and wisdom. And wisdom is no guarantee for beauty, by the way. Music is the best. The original first full text of The Adventures of Gregory Peccary was published in Warner Reprise's magazine Circular on October 9, 1972, and was likely written by Frank Zappa as early as August 1972. In this text, the story begins in Gregory's apartment. Very trendy posters on the walls of his apartment announce the little wild boar.
Oh, here comes Gregory, little Gregory Peccary, the nocturnal wine.
The narrator of the story appears on that scene. He is dressed very stiffly and fashionably in the Victorian style of the 1890s. Gregory doesn't even notice the narrator, as he is busy primping in front of the mirror to get ready for work.
A peccary is a little pig with a white collar that usually hangs around between Texas and Paraguay, sometimes ranging as far west as Catalina. This particular peccary, however, is a prime specimen of that delightful endangered species, which distinguishes itself by markings which resemble a double D tie directly beneath the white collar.
Gregory glances at a well-known rock and roll magazine, drinks a cup of yoga tea, and heads out to his red Volkswagen. In the well-known lyrics to Zappa's released composition, the narrator is not described in further detail. However, there are notable musical references that give us a sense of the story's atmosphere. You can find out which songs are sampled in Gregory Peccary by reading the highly recommended books The Big Note by Charles Ulrich and Cosmic Debris by Greg Russo. Or you can visit the fantastic website donlope.net, which was mentioned in another video. The full spectrum of musical references ranges from Julius Fertig's Circus March, Entry of the Gladiators, to Richard Berry's Louie Louie and Herbie Hancock's Chameleon, to name just a few. And then I made a random discovery that was quite enlightening to me, somehow. Since Frank Zappa repeatedly mentions Spike Jones as an influence on the humor in his music without specifying particular Spike Jones recordings, I bought a random compilation CD called Radio Days by Spike Jones and his City Slickers. And there I made what I consider an incredible discovery in the track Portia and the Hollywood Wolf. It's not an exact quote that I found, but it captures the rhythm and mood of the passage I'm referring to. The whole vibe, short and striking. Listen for yourself.
In a long, low, convertible with a top that went up and down.
Is part of that bold, new breed that extinguishes itself by markings which resemble a wide tie directly below the white collar.
And now both on top of each other.
Is part of that
Long,
bold, new
low,
breed that extinguishes
convertible with a
itself
top
by
that
markings
went
which
up
resemble a wide tie directly below the
and
white
down.
collar.
Whatever. And you could easily play the intro to Portia and the Hollywood Wolf right before The Adventures of Gregory Peccary. It fits perfectly, in my opinion.
In the following work, various sounds and musical themes will be used to represent the different characters and places in our story. Our heroine, Portia, will be recognized by this theme.
This particular peccary
If you think about the narrator's 1890s outfit in the Gregory Peccary story from the 1972 issue of Circular magazine, you could even draw a fashion-related connection. Which, of course, some people find funny and a bit silly.
The results of a higher education.
Be that as it may, in my opinion, it's worth adding Spike Jonze's Portia and the Hollywood Wolf to Zappa's conceptual continuity. It's as if Spike Jones and his musicians were an imaginary part of Zappa's band.
I've just become a mother.
The results of a higher education. Let's try a joint of this. A what? A joint. You mean this kind of joint? Oh, man. Where you been living? Reseda? No.
Let's just continue with the text. The stylish little wild boar sets off for work at the creative department of Big Swifty and Associates, trendmongers. Once there, Gregory makes his way through the steno pool to his office, where he comes up with trends designed purely to waste time. On his way through the stenography pool, he greets Mildred, Gladys, and Wanda, casually asking if any mail has arrived for him. As he weaves his way through the stenographer's room, he casually poses philosophical questions. For example, whether wasting time is what life is really all about, because otherwise it would be boring. Gregory is certain he can provide an answer to everything. With a time-wasting invention, he can't wait to sit down at his replica mahogany desk, on which, among other things, lies the latest issue of the Whole Earth catalog. Since Frank Zappa had finished writing his first text for Gregory Peccary around August 1972, this is most certainly the last Whole Earth catalog from January 1971 and its March 1971 supplement. In June 1971, a reprint of all issues from 1968 to 1971 was published as a thick book. It was the first time a catalog had won the prestigious National Book Award in the Contemporary Affairs category. The idea for the Whole Earth catalog came from Stuart Brand. His catalog was aimed primarily at readers from the counterculture, also known as hippies. The introduction to each catalog reads as follows.
Function. The Whole Earth catalog functions as an evaluation and access device. With it, the user should know better what is worth getting and where and how to get it. An item is listed in the catalog if it is deemed 1. Useful as a tool, 2. Relevant to independent education, 3. High quality or low cost, 4. Not already common knowledge, 5. Easily available by mail. Purpose. We are like gods and might as well get good at it. So far, power and glory exercised from a distance through government, big business, formal education, and the church have succeeded to the point where gross defects obscure actual gains. In response to this dilemma and to these gains, a realm of intimate personal power is developing. The power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the Whole Earth catalog.
That concludes the introduction to the catalog. The broad interpretation of tool coincided with that given by the designer, philosopher, and engineer Buckminster Fuller, though another thinker admired by Brand and some of his cohorts was Lewis Mumford, who had written about words as tools. Just as an aside, I personally have no problem calling these tools toys. Words can also be used like toys or not. By 1971, Brand and his co-workers were already questioning whether Fuller's sense of direction might be too anthropocentric. And anthropocentrism is the belief that human beings are the central or most important entity on the planet. Of course, a curious little wild boar with a white collar can only wonder at such a philosophy. In addition to his calling as a philosopher, Buckminster Fuller was also a designer, author, and inventor. In 1967, he was elected an honorary member of Phi Beta Kappa. In the 1700s, when Phi Beta Kappa was founded, it was a secret society intended to protect its members and instill a sense of solidarity. The new society was given the motto, "The love of wisdom is the guide to life." The so-called Romanel Phi Beta Kappa professorship recognizes not only distinguished achievement, but also the recipient's contribution or potential contribution to the public's understanding of philosophy. You also received money for this. Since the founding fathers were anti-Masonic, some of the original members became Freemasons later in life. Owning a lot of books about Freemasonry does not automatically make one a Freemason. A freethinker can learn from such books how a group of dubious characters twists ancient Egyptian truths to feel and present themselves as a non-Egyptian elite. Phonetically, the title Phi Beta Kappa is reminiscent of a very famous poster. Hanging this poster probably says more about tolerance, equality, and the concept of one size fits all than the diploma from the phonetically similar society. What I'd like to add about the Whole Earth catalog is this. In a 1969 issue, there's an ad on one page for a book by Forster and Beauchamp called Music for Computers. The editor responsible for the ad ends it with the question, "What I want to know is, can Frank Zappa use it?" On another page, there's a mention of the Plaster Casters, noting that Frank Zappa is their sponsor and patron. The author, here known as the Realist, was told by Zappa that this, along with the GTO's diaries, constitutes an important sociological document. The author also writes that Herb Cohen suggested making lollipops out of the Plaster Casters' penis casts and selling them under the name Suck Your Favorite Star, which the author of the short article considers capitalist. In a 1970 issue, there is a photo of Frank Zappa playing a harp. And in the aforementioned issue of the Whole Earth catalog, which lies on Gregory Peccary's replica mahogany desk, there is an advertisement for a book that was published as early as 1967 by Richard Scorer and Harry Wexler. The title of the book is Cloud Studies in Color. Now let's continue with the text from The Adventures of Gregory Peccary. Before Gregory Peccary enters his office, which has already been partially described, the stenographers call out to him that they are making his toys very busy, and just for him. Gregory calls out, "Highly efficient, Miss Snodgrass," enters his office, and immediately begins inventing the calendar, an invention intended to answer the meaning of eternity. He rolls his eyes toward the sky as mysterious angelic voices ring out, and the word
Sunday, wow,
resounds, which immediately becomes an inspiration for his new trend. I immediately wondered why Gregory, unlike with Mildred, Gladys, and Wanda, addresses Miss Snodgrass by her last name and marital status, and shortly thereafter has a divine inspiration. My research revealed that there was no Miss Snodgrass who had stood out in 1972 or in the years prior. However, there was William DeWitt Snodgrass, with a D in his name, as for example in Denamaland, which means in the end not really something. Snodgrass's friends called him simply D. He was a professor with a Master of Fine Arts degree, and he was a poet, writing autobiographically infused works with titles such as /Compositions. One of his poems that can be associated with the calendar, that is, time, is titled April Inventory. Snodgrass frequently uses seasonal metaphors to depict the passage of time. In April Inventory, he observes how his students appear younger every year, while he himself loses hair and teeth. In this poem, he also writes,
I taught myself to name my name, to bark back, loosen love and crying, to ease my woman so she came, to ease an old man who was dying.
April Inventory was first published in 1957 and appeared in Snodgrass' poetry collection, Heart's Needle, in 1959. For this collection, he received the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1960. And it has been said that Hart's Needle inaugurated confessional poetry. Confessional poetry has been described as poetry of the personal, or I, focusing on extreme moments of individual experience, the psyche and personal trauma, including previously and occasionally still taboo matters such as mental illness, sexuality, and suicide, often set in relation to broader social themes.
Father, I'm glad you're here. I want you to hear this. I have a confession to make. You know?
Well, spit it out, son.
Leather.
In 1960, when Snodgrass won the Pulitzer Prize, he was inducted as an honorary member of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, 7 years before Buckminster Fuller. Snodgrass was married a total of 4 times. I do not know whether his 3 ex-wives and his 4th wife ever worked in a steno pool. Back to the office next to the stenography pool, after Gregory Peccary hears the word Sunday in angelic voices, he adds Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday to this inspiration, and immediately asks himself, "What hath God wrought?" What hath God wrought is a famous phrase from Numbers 23:23 in the Bible, King James Version, declaring that no magic or curse can prevail against God's people. It signifies divine protection and marvelous deeds. This phrase was also famously used by Samuel Morse to mark the first telegraph message in 1844, celebrating a miraculous accomplishment. As for Samuel Morse, one could also point out that he was essentially a nationalist and believed that slavery was acceptable and happened according to God's will. What an idiot! At this point, I'd like to note that it's certainly striking how much my videos deal with space, time, heads of pins, the true self, alchemy, physics, Egypt, truth, the many gods, the one God, the big note, and so on. The reason for this is quite simply this: Frank Zappa's art and what he has to say when you ask the right questions, even between the lines.
Frank Zappa is going to be the narrator of L'Histoire des Soldats, Stravinsky's ballet with acting and dancing. Story of a soldier in which he's the narrator. And I wonder why.
Well, first of all, I was offered the job of being the devil, and I liked the music, and so I said, well, okay, I'll be the devil. And I decided, no, I don't want to be the devil, and I called them back, and I said, no, I decided not to be the devil. I can't do it. And they said, well, how about being the narrator? And I said, okay, so I'm going to be the narrator.
Back to Gregory. There were quite a few people who didn't want to know how old they were, or when something was going to happen that they wouldn't like anyway. And they decided to attack the little curious Peccary. And Gregory Peccary had to flee in his red Volkswagen Beetle. On the highway, his pursuers, a wild bunch of slowly aging people with acid-drenched eyes and back problems, on motorcycles, in cars, and in painted buses, try to force him off the road. Gregory leaves the road to shake off his pursuers, which he succeeds in doing. He hides himself and his Volkswagen while the wild mob, also known as the Hunchmen and Hunchwomen, gives up the search for him, forms a circular pseudo-wagon train formation, and holds a love-in under the influence of a fantastic amount of trendy chemical amusement aid. While the love-in community sets up several radios, each tuned to a different station, Gregory hears a rumbling laugh from inside his cave hideout. He doesn't realize that the cave he's in is actually the mouth of Billy the Mountain, husband of Ethel, who is a tree growing out of his shoulder. The story of Billy the Mountain is a fantastic Frank Zappa tale in its own right. Be sure to listen to it. A great companion. All we need to know now for the adventures of Gregory Peccary is that every time Billy laughs, rocks and boulders come loose, tumble down, and send up a series of new brown clouds. And immediately, the curious little wild boar wonders who could be making these new brown clouds, not realizing that it's because of the rocks and boulders, and that the cave is Billy's mouth. In scientific studies, new brown clouds are also referred to as dark clouds or interstellar clouds. Given the height of Mount Billy, which gave rise to the brown clouds, Frank Zappa's high standing in the entertainment world as an artist, and his high intelligence, let's take a brief journey into space.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story of Angry, the little Danish astronomer. Bring the band on down behind me, boys. We're gonna get too soon. Just settle into a groove. Tycho Brahe. The name brings, why the name itself, why it just conjures up duels and telescopes. Everything. What a name. Anyway, Tycho Brahe really was in a duel. The poor sucker got his nose shot off, or chopped off or something. Being industrious, and also Danish, he decided that instead of going through life with a big hole in the middle of his face, and this is the honest-to-God truth, ladies and gentlemen, fashioned for himself a nose made out of copper, which he attached to his head. He really had a copper nose. What an astronomer. Tycho Brahe was also a shrewd little sucker, and he had the King of Denmark whipped because I guess the king of Denmark had an interest in things of a celestial nature. So Tycho Brahe conned the poor dude into constructing for his edification a very spiffy observatory, probably one of the neatest observatories of its day and age, located on a little island just offshore in the middle of the North Sea. That was Tycho Brahe's hangout, you know what I mean? And he was heavy into the sky with a popper nose, you know what I mean? So this is the story of Tycho Brahe assembling his observatory. One day he says to the king, you know, there's a lot going on out there. Those little white dots you see may control your destiny. And the king says, I can dig it, Tycho. What can I do for you, my boy? Tycho Brahe says, well, look here, king. I need the biggest, juiciest, most succulent telescope you ever laid your regal eyes on. And the king says, what do I know from the telescope? Tycho says, don't worry about it. I've got you covered. Let me tell you, if you will just procure for me the world's largest cardboard linoleum pole and have it shipped over here, I will put together an observatory on your behalf that will allow me to make astrological predictions as well as astronomical computations. And that's going to put you on the charts. What do you think about that? And the king said, I can dig it, Tycho. So he used his connections, got a hold of the Armstrong Linoleum Company and says, hey, Mr. Armstrong, send me the big tube. Well, they didn't have airplane then, so they had to ship it by boat. So here comes the big tube on a barge across the sea. Poor thing nearly withering away from the salt spray getting soggy around the edges. But because it was a large and valiant tube, it took a little tugboat ride and stride. And when it finally landed on the banks of this Japanese little island off the coast of Denmark, where they're going to build the observatory, Tycho himself helped to haul it up on the boat and took it up to the laboratory where he warmed it in front of a fire and take some of the wrinkles out of it. And got it all spiffed over till they thought it was really making it. Then he said to the king, I need the lens because in order to look up there, you need more than a big tube. You need something to make the dots bigger. And the king says, what do I know from a lens? And Tycho Brahe says, you ever heard of Coca-Cola? And the king says, yeah, I can dig it. Right, 6 days of empty coal bottles to the blast furnace right away. So he melts down the coal bottles and he gets a bunch of Danish coolies to plug it until it was just like a big lens. And he stuffs up the end of the linoleum roll and peers out right into the sky. And he dips out his charts, his diagrams, with his big tweezers. When you go from thing to thing with a chart like that, there's a scratch in the back of his head. You go, you know what, King? I think I've got the prediction under control. He steps away from telling them, goes over to the king and says, I'm going to tell you your future. And all it's going to cost you is one observatory. Your future consists of this. You're going to be the tall, dark, handsome stranger in the Wichita, Kansas, Greyhound bus depot fence room. And the king said, hey, I've never heard of this place where it indicates a new conquest for the Danish kingdom. So the king goes away to meditate on his astrological computation. And becoming so enthralled with the prospect of the Danish people taking over Kansas, he proceeded to roll it into a tube, stick it over his putts, whack it till in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Tycho, industrious little popper-nosed fiend that he was, turns the swivel of his observatory dome in the direction of the king's bedroom window and trains an enormous cardboard telescope right in there and watch the king doing it. To this very day, the photograph that Tycho Brahe took, the cardboard tube, of the king. This is meant for the formulation of all of the Danish pornographic literature masterpieces.
With us now, we have a well-known Danish psychologist, Mr. Ove Lundin. Mr. Lundin, could you tell us a little about your job?
Yeah, I'm a psychologist at the Institute of Clinical Psychology at the University of Copenhagen. I'm a therapist and an educator of younger psychologists.
As a psychologist, I could imagine that you couldn't help consider the changes in sexual freedom and censorship.
Well, as a psychologist, but also as a human being, of course, I cannot avoid considering, but I consider it more as a symptom of greater freedom in this society, of less strict rules and norms. Of course, we focus with more interest on this subject because it has suffered from the conspiracy of silence previously.
The society has expected an increase in crime rates with freedom of sex. What is your comment on that?
Well, there has been no increase. To the contrary, there has been a decrease.
Do you think that, or is it known whether this decrease in sex rates has affected the younger people more than the older, or opposite?
Especially the younger people.
As a psychologist, do you think that there's a greater evil to repression against sexual freedom than to allow sexual freedom?
We know that the consequences of the repression of sexual life, among others, are a restricted and unsatisfactory sexual life. We are now trying out more freedom in sexual life. And as far as I can see, at least the next generation will take advantage of it. Of course, it's not without problems, but why not give it a try?
Thank you very much, Mr. Lundin. It has been most interesting to talk to you.
Dark clouds, also known as interstellar clouds, often have a brownish color. This is due to contamination by dust. These new brown clouds form in regions of outer space, where dwarf stars, dark nebulae, and dwarf nebulae are found. The distance from Earth to these clouds and the density of the dust within them can be determined by bombarding them with different radio frequencies. Sent from Earth. Information is collected by radio telescopes on Earth. These radio telescopes are set up in higher altitude regions, such as hills or mountains. Unfortunately, I am not familiar with the book Cloud Studies in Color by Scorer and Wexler, which is listed in the Whole Earth catalog as mentioned before. The basis for my statements comes mainly from a report by the American Astronomical Society provided by the NASA Astrophysics Data System. It dates from October 1971 and was published in early 1972. This report demonstrates that the formation of interstellar clouds is an ionization process. Ionization equilibria in interstellar clouds are determined by a balance between ionization, photoionization by UV/X-rays, cosmic rays, and recombination, electron-ion, charge transfer. The term brown clouds is not used in this report. The report was written by Robert L. Brown for the National Radio Observatory, so they are Brown's clouds. But Gregory Peccary, the inventor of the calendar, which he considers a divine revelation, doesn't want a scientific explanation for these new brown clouds. In Zappa's text from the 1972 issue of Circular magazine, Gregory leaves the cave, pondering the cosmic significance of his dangerous experience and the ominous dust storm. He wants to find a philosophical meaning, so he heads to a gas station and makes a mysterious phone call from there. He calls an old loft and asks if he is connected to the place where the Chinese police patrol, where the philosophers are kept, and where the books go to die. And Gregory definitely needs a philosopher's help to learn more about the new brown clouds. Here I can only speculate about which real-life events are being referred to in Gregory Peccary's phone call. What stands out, of course, is the Chinese police that Gregory mentions. During the Chinese Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, books on Far Eastern philosophy, among other things, were banned, and in some cases even burned. These philosophical works contained teachings on the microcosm and the macrocosm, which represents an Eastern version of as above, so below, on Taoism, on the idea that one size fits all, on Naden, internal alchemy, and on Zen Buddhism. In Once a Catholic by Peter Occhiogrosso, Frank Zappa recounts that at the age of 16, in 1956, he was still a devout Catholic, but after reading the book Comparative Religions and learning about Zen Buddhism, he was deeply impressed. Not by Catholicism anymore so much because of the dogma stuff, and Buddhism and Taoism were banned during the Chinese Cultural Revolution as reactionary superstitions. Perhaps Gregory Peccary also knew that Alice in Wonderland had been banned in the Chinese province of Hunan since 1931 and was banned and burned throughout China starting in 1966, since it equates animals with humans. But first of all, that has nothing to do with philosophy, and second, I'm just a dog. As I said, I can only speculate about the secret behind Gregory Peccary's mysterious call.
Gregory receives information that the greatest living philosopher known to mankind is currently in possession of the very information in question. And furthermore, this information could be his if only Gregory would attend a special therapeutic group assembly. Classes now forming and available at a special low introductory fee. And now here he is, the greatest living philosopher known to mankind, Quentin Robert de Nameland.
Anyway, one of the first mentions of Quentin Robert de Nameland can be found on a drawing created jointly by Frank and Gail Zappa. Frank Zappa signed it in March 1970 and Gail Zappa in October 1971. The whole thing looks like a game board. De Nameland introduces himself to a companion, both sitting in a boat. The two go ashore, and de Nameland speech bubbles turn into images. The first image looks like instructions for building a chair. The second is blurry. I'd like to see the image in higher resolution. To me, it could be a bird's plumage, or perhaps a rocky abyss. Shortly after, de Nameland's companion vanishes into thin air, or becomes part of de Nameland, who keeps walking as if nothing had happened. Next, de Nameland is sitting in a tree, and his speech bubble shows a computer. On it, possibly Gail Zappa has written the word certainly. In de Nameland's next speech, bubble is a kind of electronic circuit on which someone has written the word alternatively. The drawing ends with the words, no doubt more later. The philosopher Quentin Robert de Nameland could be based on L. Ron Hubbard, who, as is well known, frequently appears in altered forms in Zappa's work. Hubbard was initially a science fiction author, wrote non-fiction books, dabbled in the occult, and founded the Church of Scientology, partly for tax reasons. Their ideology was based on a combination of scientific and psychotherapeutic-sounding elements, which were later expanded to include transcendental aspects. All of this, of course, for the benefit of the people who pay for it. L. Ron Hubbard's first son was named L. Ron Hubbard Jr. He was born prematurely and survived only because his father constructed a makeshift incubator using a shoebox, later a cupboard drawer, and used blankets and an electric light bulb to keep the baby warm. L. Ron Hubbard Jr. later distanced himself from his father's ideologies and changed his name to Ronald D. Wolfe, as he viewed his father's cult as money-grubbing. Ronald D. Wolfe had a younger brother named Quentin Hubbard. Quentin Hubbard took his own life in 1976 at the age of 22, just as he was set to become his father's successor in the Church of Scientology. The second time Quentin Robert D. Nameland appears is in a one-page comic created by Frank Zappa and Calvin Schenkel. The curtain comes up. The comic was created for a comic anthology compiled by Michel Choquette. Choquette's idea was to get world-renowned artists, including those from other fields of art, to contribute a comic for his later oversized book titled Someday Funnies. Choquette was already acquainted with Frank Zappa, as he and his partner Peter Elbing had opened several shows for the Mothers of Invention on their 1969 UK tour under the name the Times Square 2.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Times Square 2.
Speaking of Hawaii. Hello, Hawaii. How are you? Let me talk to Honolulu. To ask her this thing. Give me a kiss. Give me a kiss. I want this. Please stay. I can't wait to hear her reply. For I have gone every little bit out. Top from New York through the wire. Hello, Hawaii. How are you?
It was in February 1972 when Choquette met Zappa in Los Angeles. That is, at a time when Zappa had not long been discharged from the hospital and from his wheelchair had begun to put his profound ideas for philosophical and musical concepts into practice. The comic solidified Quentin Robert D. Nameland's appearance, a sort of magician wearing a hat and a robe with Saturn and other stars visible on it, exactly as Zappa described him in his first lyrics for Gregory Peccary in Circular magazine in 1972.
The greatest philosTopher known to mankind enters with a long blue robe on. He also has a tall pointed hat with Saturns, etc. on it.
In addition to Frank Zappa, Michel Choquette also met with Harlan Ellison and Jack Kirby, who contributed comics. Just as an aside, Jack Kirby and Frank Zappa became friends. There are even drawings for a Valley Girl comic that Kirby created for Zappa, but they were never published.
My artwork is popular because it connects with the ordinary person, and they can understand it very easily. And I've always meant it to be so. I've never confined my art to a particular section of humanity. I love people in general. My art reflects it, and that's the way it's always been. My character's relationship with the reader is my own relationship. I love people in general, and that's reflected in my characters. My characters are very human, and the next guy recognizes himself in any character I draw, no matter how fantastic that character is. The next guy will always relate to him because despite the fact that he's incapable, the next guy is incapable of doing these superhuman tasks, his motivations and the character's motivations are exactly alike. They're human reactions, and the reader recognizes that, and he recognizes that factor even in the villains. Well, the cosmic characters represent omnipotence, and I felt that we always had contact with that kind of thing. All our myths, all our legends reflect our addiction to create legends. And I feel that's a human quality. And I felt that I had that quality within myself. And I created my own myths, my own gods, the new gods. I felt there should be new gods since we've always been using the old gods. So I felt that it was time to create a new kind of legend.
Back to Frank Zappa and Cal Schenkel's The Curtain Comes Up. Choquette's comic collection, Someday Funnies, became too massive for the publisher and seemed to have no commercial potential. The artist couldn't be paid, and the whole project was put on hold. It wasn't until 40 years later that a publisher took the plunge and published the highly recommended collection as a large format book in November 2011. Alongside internationally renowned comic artists, you can now see works by Federico Fellini, Pete Townsend, William S. Burroughs, and of course Frank Zappa with Calvin Schenkel, among others. There is another clue as to who is actually hiding behind Quentin Robert D. Nameland, the greatest living philosopher known to mankind. But hear it for yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, the moment that you've all been waiting for is here and now. Quentin Robert D. Nameland, greatest living two-headed philosopher known to mankind, is about to speak.
The two-headed philosopher. In the version we know, there is no longer any mention of two heads, and Quentin Robert D. Nameland text has been heavily abridged. The recording that Zappa played still contains the text as it appeared in Circular Magazine 72 and the 1972 comic The Curtain Comes Up. The mention of two heads opens a wormhole, so to speak, or is like falling down a rabbit hole. I will try to make a relatively quick list of things that seem related and paint a bigger picture. First, in alchemical philosophy, there is the two-headed rebus. It symbolizes the magnum opus of the great work. The two heads represent the conjunction of opposites, which includes the creation of gold on one hand and the discovery of the philosopher's stone on the other, many other things of opposites. Second, the rebus is an integral part of the so-called azoth, which is a universal remedy or potent solvent sought after in the realm of alchemy. Azoth later evolved into a poetic expression for the element mercury. Azoth is closely connected to Ein Sof in Kabbalah. Third, Ein Sof is understood as God before any self-manifestation in the creation of any spiritual realm. Fourth, Ein Sof is closely related phonetically to Sofa number 1. Sofa number 1 is an instrumental track and appears on Zappa's album, One Size Fits All. The album also features the track Sofa number 2. Sofa number 2 has lyrics. These lyrics are sung by the Big G after his self-manifestation in the creation of any spiritual realm. Fifth, on the album cover of One Size Fits All, you can see a coin featuring Mercury, the messenger of the gods, whereby Mercury is the poetic evolution of Azoth. Sixth, Ein Sof basically means that one size fits all. A sofa is translated into German as Ein Sofa. In the track Once Upon a Time from You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore, Volume 1, Zappa explains that the Big G always speaks German when heavy business is on the agenda, and thus introduces the song Sofa, sung by Flo and Eddie. Seventh, when Frank Zappa announced his album One Size Fits All with great joy, he announced with equally great joy that there would be a follow-up album to One Size Fits All, one closely related to One Size Fits All, and that it would feature the masterpiece The Adventures of Gregory Peccary, most likely that acetate version he played on the radio. Unfortunately, the follow-up album was never released. Eighthly, divine is a phonetic corruption of the German word divan, which means sofa. While the album One Size Fits All mainly deals with man, creation, and space, Gregory Peccary would have dealt with man, creation, and time. Ninth, if you look for a two-headed philosopher, you'll also find the philosopher Parmenides. His thoughts were headed in two essential directions of reality. On the one hand, there is aletheia, which stands for the truth, which means that all reality is one and existence is therefore timeless. And the second reality is doxa, or in other words, the opinion, which describes the world of appearances in which sensory perceptions lead to false and deceptive ideas. These two views of reality shaped his philosophy of time. Parmenides rejected the existence of non-being as something cannot be nothing. His concept of eternal being was one that is without regard to time. Since change cannot occur within being, there are no intervals by which time can be measured. One could also say it like Frank Zappa.
What something is depends more on when it is than anything else. We have devised our own personal universe and lifestyle, ruled by time, sliced this way. It seems just as feasible to me that everything's happening all the time.
Parmenides developed a system defined by opposites based on light and dark. Mortal perception of the world involves the shifting light and dark within a person, which creates subjective mortal opinions that can differ between individuals. This was the first philosophical model of how sensory perception relates to mental understanding. The existence of light and dark implies that being and non-being exist simultaneously. It is this contradiction that prevents mortals from understanding the true nature of being. Quentin Robert D. Nameland talks about these things in his own style. He's into dogma strategies like,
well, folks, as you can see for yourself, the way this clock over here is behaving, time is of affliction. This might be cause for alarm, unfortunately, as from a certain experience I tend to proclaim. The eons are closing.
And he continues with,
now what does this mean precisely to the layman? Simply this. Momentarily, the need for the construction of new light will no longer exist. Of course, some of you will think, who is he to be telling me about this light?
Which is strategically very clever.
But in all seriousness, ladies and gentlemen, a quick glance at the erratic behavior of the large, precision-built, time-delineating apparatus beside me will show that it is perhaps only a few moments now. Look how funny it's going around there. Personally, I find mechanical behavior of this nature to be highly suspicious. When such a device doesn't go normal, the implications of such a behavior bodes not well, if you know what that means. And quite naturally, ladies and gentlemen, if the mechanism in question is entrusted with the task of the delineation of time itself, such a mechanism go? For the Fritz. Well, it spells trouble. Make your checks payable to Quentin Robert D. Nameland, greatest living philosopher known to mankind. Thank you, and call again.
Who is making those new brown clouds? Who is making those clouds these days? Who is making those new brown clouds? If you ask the philosopher, he'll see that you praise. Gee whiz, it sure is expensive. That geek has ripped me off.
Maybe it's a trend.
Frank Zappa's view of time is essentially a view of a Möbius strip. Everything is happening all the time. In my video, As Above, So Below, and Elsewhere, I created a kind of graphic to illustrate this. Instead of a Möbius strip, I designed a cube made up of many cubes, which are themselves composed of heads of pins. There's a 0 point in the center of the cube through which action strands, meaning strands and event strands, run. At the 0 point, time doesn't exist, because this 0 point reveals what happens at the beginning or end of any strand. At the 0 point, everything happens simultaneously, regardless of whether it's 10 minutes or 10,000 years apart in the story of any strand. If you'd like to have some fun with these kinds of thought experiments, I recommend the science fiction novel Space-Time Donuts by Rudy Rucker. Rudolf von Bitter-Rucker is an American mathematician, computer scientist, science fiction author, and one of the founders of the cyberpunk literary movement. And he's a Frank Zappa fan. In his novel Space-Time Donuts, Zappa's album Apostrophe plays a role, specifically the song Stinkfoot. While the novel's protagonists stand in a kitchen listening to the part of the song where the dog...
This is a dog talking now. What is your conceptual continuity?
Yes, the dog explains the concept of conceptual continuity. They shrink. The ground beneath them slowly becomes gentle hills, gradually transforming into mountains. Mountain ranges and valleys open up beneath them. The valleys deepen. The apparent grains of sand in the valleys below grow to the size of footballs. These balls become large spheres that resemble models of molecular bonds. The molecular bonds become individual atoms. The atoms grow as large as planets. The distances between the planets increase. The protagonists seem to float freely in an infinite blackness, yet beneath them a small sphere grows ever larger. Soon this smallest particle becomes ever larger, growing and growing beneath their feet, becoming a planet. And soon the travelers realize that they have arrived precisely at the point where their journey began, in the kitchen, where the dog in Zappa's song Stinkfoot explains the conceptual continuity. Rudy Rucker's novel Space-Time Donuts has been translated into German as Gödel, Zappa, Rock and Roll, which is very fitting and works well, in my opinion. It's actually a reference to the 1979 book Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, a metaphorical fugue in minds and machines in the spirit of Lewis Carroll by Douglas Hofstadter. It's a book about the intellectual themes common to the lives and works of the logician Kurt Gödel, the artist M.C. Escher, and the composer Johann Sebastian Bach. and shows the thematic connections between mathematics, symmetry, and intelligence. It's about the Möbius strip, to be precise. If books make you sleepy, but you're very interested in these thought experiments about infinity and the idea that everything is constantly happening, then just look at the paintings of the artist Moritz Cornelis Escher, or listen to Johann Sebastian Bach's Crab Canon. I also recommend the short film Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames from 1977, which deals with conceptual continuity. If you're interested in an entertaining way to learn about the things that happen in our universe, whether philosophically or purely scientifically, and you don't forget Fulcanelli's Language of Birds, parables also known as cant or slang, then just stick with Frank Zappa. Listen to his works and read or listen to some interviews with him.
The theory of the cosmic fart. It seems that, from what I got a chance to read on this tour, in a little low-grade book on astronomy, most of the material of the known universe is hydrogen. And the closest we're going to get to a star right now is a fart, hydrogen sulfide. And I can see a situation with soldiers sitting around a barracks, igniting their farts with cigarette lighters after drinking a lot of beer and trying desperately to get laid in some foreign port. Sitting around creating novas in the barracks, and they don't even know it. There it is. The cosmic fart.
This is extremely scientifically accurate. Good night.